how and where the top Wild West legends died. Did you know one frontier icon etched his legend not with blazing 6 guns or a runaway train, but with a flourish of poetry and impeccable manners? We'll unravel that surprise soon. Right now, gather round for the incredible tales galloping your way. Black Bart burst into national lore not with blazing 6 guns or a running train, but with a flourish of poetry and impeccable manners. From 1877 to 1883, he robbed at least 28 Wells Fargo stagecoaches in California and Southern Oregon, always alone, always on foot, and always wielding an unloaded shotgun. He addressed drivers as Sir, never touched a passenger's purse, and sometimes left behind a mocking verse signed Black Bart, the poet. Newspapers took to calling him the Gentleman Bandit, and the public, hungry for a romantic contrast to blood-soaked desperados, made him a folk hero even before the law caught up. His courteous style is why his nickname still echoes across the American West, and why his mysterious disappearance after prison keeps historians guessing to this day. Roots of a restless soul. Charles Earl Bowles was born in Norfolk, England, in 1829 and carried to upstate New York as a toddler, where his family farmed near Plattsburgh. He grew up chasing frontier stories, and, when gold fever swept America in 1849, joined 2 older brothers on the long trek to California. The venture proved harsh. Their claims yielded little, and both brothers died of illness in the Sierra camps. Shaken, Charles went home and tried domestic life, marrying Mary Elizabeth Johnson in Illinois and fathering 4 children. The quiet did not last. When the Civil War erupted, he enlisted in the 116th Illinois Infantry. Bowles fought at Vicksburg, Champion Hill, and Sherman's March to the Sea, rising to first sergeant and surviving a chest wound that left him short of breath for life. Discharged in 1865, he tasted farming again, but soon felt the old itch for mountains and pay dirt. By 1870, he was prospecting in Idaho and Montana, a vow against Wells Fargo. Sometime in 1871, Bowles wrote home fuming that Wells Fargo agents had muscled him off a promising claim by cornering nearby water rights. He closed the letter with a cryptic promise: "The company shall yet hear from me." Soon the husband and father of 4 vanished from family life, resurfacing in San Francisco boarding houses under the genteel alias Charles E. Bolton, describing himself as a mining investor. On certain weekends he left town carrying a modest carpetbag and returned looking slightly wearier, yet no richer. Stage schedules later showed his business trips coincided with the newly famous Black Bart holdups, a polite brand of outlawry. The first confirmed robbery came on August 3, 1877, along the road between Fort Ross and Duncan's Mills. The stage rounded a bend and met a lone man in a long linen duster, a flour sack mask over his face, and a double-barreled shotgun leveled, though unloaded, across his arm. "Please throw down the box," he said calmly. The driver obeyed. Passengers were left untouched. The polite stranger vanished into manzanita thickets. When a posse reached the scene, they found a note in flowing script. "I've labored long and hard for bread, for honor and for riches, but on my corns too long you've tread. You fine-haired sons of underscore. The signature read, Black Bart, the poet. 2 more robberies soon followed, each on lonely mountain roads where a single man could spring from cover, secure the strongbox, and fade uphill while the driver struggled to turn his team. Bart's uniform never changed: duster, derby, mask, and a gentleman's diction. By 1882, Wells Fargo had placed a $300 reward on him, small compared to sums dangled for violent outlaws, but large enough to spur every sheriff's posse in Northern California. The Unraveling. On November 3, 1883, near Copperopolis, Black Bart struck again. This time wind and rain forced him to linger longer than usual, prying at a bolted treasure box. As he slogged off with the gold, a pursuing stage driver fired several pistol shots. One clipped Bart's left hand. He escaped but, in his haste, dropped a silk handkerchief bearing the laundry mark FX07. Detective James B. Hume of Wells Fargo canvassed San Francisco laundries for days until a Chinese laundryman recognized the mark and pointed to a boarding house customer, Charles Bolton. A quiet arrest followed. Inside Bolton's trunk lay a dusty duster, a mask, 2 poems in familiar scrawl, and an unprimed shotgun. Confronted with the evidence, the weary outlaw confessed to the Copperopolis job and admitted to earlier robberies he thought beyond the statute of limitations. He pled guilty to 1 count and received 6 years in San Quentin. Gentleman behind bars. At 54, Bart entered prison a graying, slight man who still said sir to his guards. He tutored illiterate inmates, kept books for the prison library, and earned early release for exemplary conduct on January 21, 1888, serving barely half his sentence. Reporters thronged the gate that morning, peppering him with questions. He tipped his hat, joked he would probably take up a respectable profession, like stagecoach driving, and boarded a southbound train under surveillance. Vanishing act. For 2 weeks, Wells Fargo detectives shadowed him as he drifted south through the San Joaquin Valley, stopping in Fresno, then Visalia. On February 28, 1888, he checked into the Visalia House Hotel, signed the register C.E. Bolton, retired early, and evaporated before dawn. The room was neat, the bed unslept in, and every lead ended at the back alley. That date is the last confirmed sighting of Black Bart. Theories of death. Rumors sprang up like desert wildflowers. Some swore he turned up a few years later clerking in a Marysville pharmacy, gray and stooped, dying quietly around 1914 and buried in an unmarked grave near Knight's Landing. Others pointed to a Brooklyn obituary in 1917 for Charles E. Bowles, Civil War veteran, whose age matched the outlaws. Nevada mining ledgers record a Charles Bolton, dying of pneumonia near Sutro Tunnel circa 1905. A former Wells Fargo detective once claimed Bart booked steerage passage to Yokohama, intending to hide where American warrants held no sway. None of these stories has stood unassailable, and no death certificate closes the file. Legacy of a teasing outlaw. Black Bart's mystique rests on that empty final chapter. Had he died in a gunfight or on a scaffold, the legend would be neatly footnoted. Instead, his gentle diction, solitary style, and unfinished story combined to make him the West's enduring enigma. A man who robbed for revenge, but prided himself on spilling no blood, who mocked his pursuers in rhyme, and who stepped off the historical stage as quietly as he had stepped onto the dusty road 5 decades earlier. To this day, reenactments across the Sierra foothills pause at the moment he disappears into the brush, inviting audiences to imagine where the Gentleman Bandit went when the curtain fell, and whether he chuckled one last time at the mystery he left behind. Annie Oakley's legend was forged not in the smoky saloons of Dodge City or the bloody streets of Tombstone, but on exhibition ranges from Ohio cornfields to the grand boulevards of Europe. At a time when the Wild West was marketed as a man's playground of gunfighters and scouts, she stepped forward with a .22 caliber rifle, split a playing card edge on it 20 paces, and rewrote the frontier story. Crowds gasped. Newspapermen nicknamed her Little Sure Shot. Heads of state rose to their feet. She became the first American woman to earn international fame purely for her skill with a firearm, and she did it while dressed in a fringed calico skirt, smiling shyly beneath a broad-brimmed hat. That blend of deadly accuracy and modest demeanor is why her name still rings like a well-placed shot more than a century later. Hard beginnings. Annie was born Phoebe and Mosey on August 13, 1860, in a log farmhouse near North Star, Ohio, the 6th of 9 children. Her father, Jacob, a veteran of the War of 1812, died from exposure after trudging home through a blizzard when Annie was only 6. The loss plunged the family into deep poverty. To keep food on the table, her mother, Susan, took in sewing and eventually sent Annie to work for a neighboring family who promised schooling but delivered near indentured labor. Annie later called those 2 years her slavery time, recalling beatings and starvation so acute she sometimes gnawed scraps destined for the hogs. At age 15 she escaped, returned home, and shouldered the family's survival. She picked up her deceased father's old percussion rifle, learned its weight, and began supplying local shopkeepers with fresh game. Legend says her first day's haul of quail and rabbits cleared enough profit to pay off the mortgage interest. What is certain is that her shooting fed her siblings and rebuilt her mother's finances. By winter's end, she was the best-known market hunter in Darke County, firing as many as 200 rounds before breakfast and rarely missing. The match that changed her life. In the autumn of 1875, a traveling Irish marksman named Frank Butler arrived in nearby Cincinnati, boasting he could beat any local crack shot for $100, roughly a year's wage for most farmers. The hotel keeper offered a challenger, a petite girl in homespun. Butler laughed, then lost the contest by one clay pigeon. Annie's calm precision stunned him more than the defeat. Within months, the two were writing letters. In August 1876, they were married. Butler shelved his ego, became her manager, and spent the next 50 years ensuring no tent flap, train schedule, or promoter ever failed his wife. Buffalo Bill's star attraction. Annie's rise from county fairs to global celebrity began in earnest in 1885 when William F. Buffalo Bill Cody invited her to join his Wild West show. She debuted in Louisville, Kentucky, firing from horseback, over her shoulder by mirror, and crowd favorite, snapping cigar tips from Frank's smiling lips. The routine lasted barely 15 minutes, yet newspapers devoted columns to it the next morning. Sitting Bull, then touring with Cody, adopted her as a sort of honorary daughter and rechristened her Little Sure Shot, sealing the brand that would follow her for the rest of her life. From 1887 to 1892, she toured Europe with Buffalo Bill, drawing packed houses at the American Exhibition in London and later in Paris, Rome, and Berlin. Queen Victoria watched Annie shatter glass balls in midair and reportedly declared, "What a darling little girl." Kaiser Wilhelm II asked Annie to shoot the ashes from the cigarette he held between thumb and forefinger. She obliged, then quipped years later that had she aimed a bit lower, there would have been no world war. Crowds were enthralled not merely by her accuracy, but by the way she softened frontier violence with grace, making the rifle seem almost ladylike. Setbacks and reinvention. Fame did not spare her mishap. In 1901, a railroad collision near Charlotte, North Carolina, hurled her from her Pullman berth, severely injuring her back and partially paralyzing one arm. Doctors predicted she would never shoot again. For 2 grim years, she wore a steel brace and practiced alone in barnyards, forcing numb fingers to reload. When she finally returned to the stage, this time in a melodrama titled The Western Girl, audiences wept at the sight of the tiny woman who had refused to surrender her art. Her reserves of grit showed again in 1903 when a syndicated newspaper falsely claimed she'd been arrested for stealing to fund a cocaine habit. The story relied on a Chicago burlesque performer using Annie's famous name. Oakley filed 55 libel suits against the newspapers that reprinted the lie and won or settled nearly every one, restoring both her finances and her good name. Final chapters. During World War I, she offered to raise a regiment of female sharpshooters for the U.S. Army and, later, to teach marksmanship to troops heading overseas. The government politely declined the regiment but accepted her training sessions. Hundreds of doughboys credited Miss Oakley for their calm trigger squeeze on the Western Front. By the early 1920s, age and lingering injuries pressed her to slow. She and Frank divided their time between winter shoots in Pinehurst, North Carolina, and a modest brick house in Greenville, Ohio, near her birthplace. She never lost her eye. At 63, she set a personal record by breaking 100 consecutive clay targets at a sportsman's meet in Florida. In 1925, her health slipped rapidly. Modern physicians believe she suffered from pernicious anemia exacerbated by kidney failure. Surrounded by family photographs and the battered Stevens shotgun that had launched her career, Annie Oakley died on November 3, 1926, in a rented cottage outside Greenville, aged 66. Frank Butler, her husband, partner, and perennial target holder, refused to eat after her passing and joined her 18 days later. Folks in Darke County still say he willed himself to follow Annie Darling rather than face a stage without her. Enduring aim. Annie Oakley's death closed an era when live exhibition shooting could enthrall kings and cowboys alike, yet her influence endured. She had taught an estimated 15,000 women to handle firearms safely, arguing that a good shot means a good vote, and she donated much of her earnings to orphans' funds and wounded veterans. Today, her silhouette, skirt hem flying, rifle leveled, remains a symbol of fearless precision and quiet defiance, reminding each new generation that skill and perseverance, not size or gender, separate the crack shot from the common marksman. Curly Bill Brocious won his place in Western memory by embodying every unruly impulse the frontier could muster. He was the laughing, trigger-happy center of the loose outlaw federation known as the Cochise County Cowboys, a gang so rowdy that townsfolk referred to any rustler or stage robber simply as one of the cowboys. When folks spoke of the wild nights in Tombstone saloons, of pistol fire under a hard desert moon, or of the one-man Wyatt Earp admitted he feared, they meant Curly Bill. Notorious for killing the town marshal with what he claimed was an accidental shot, and for leading the vendetta that set the Earps on their bloody path, Brocious became the living symbol of a territory balanced between boomtown wealth and lawless anarchy. Almost nothing about his beginnings can be proved because Curly Bill preferred it that way, shedding origin stories the way a coyote sheds dust. Some old Texans swore he was William Bresnahan. Born near Victoria in the mid-1840s, Kansas drovers insisted he had started life as William Graham. A weather-cracked wanted poster in Santa Fe listed him as William Brocious, age 28, occupation herder, hair brown and curly. What all accounts agree on is a powerful frame, a mass of springy hair that earned him the nickname, and a grin that made onlookers unsure whether to laugh along or duck for cover. He drifted through the Reconstruction South as a horse thief, gambler, and occasional trail boss, learning the value of a quick draw and an even quicker exit. By 1878, the lure of fresh silver strikes drew him west to the rolling grasslands of southeastern Arizona. Cochise County sprawled across open range perfect for cattle, but remote enough that stolen Mexican stock could be blended into American herds before any authority rode by. In crude line camps near the San Pedro River, Curly Bill fell in with Johnny Ringo, the Clantons, and the McClorys, men who shared a taste for whiskey, cards, and cross-branding, the polite phrase for rustling. Brocious was no formal leader. His charisma simply kept the campfire jokes rolling and the pistols handy. When a posse cornered a cowboy, he did not desert him. When a trail cook ran out of coffee, Curly Bill was the first to ride 50 miles through Apache country to fetch more. Loyalty of that sort drew hard men as surely as a steak dinner. Tombstone, booming on the richest silver vein in North America, provided the gang's playground. The town sat under a thin veneer of respectability tended by Marshal Fred White and a small squad of deputies. Most evenings, Curly Bill could be found in Hafford's saloon, ordering a bottle of rye, paying in gold dust, and coaxing the piano player into The Girl I Left Behind Me, while he fired revolver shots at the ceiling for rhythm. On the night of October 28, 1880, the fun went too far. Curly Bill and several cowboys were blazing away at the stars on Allen Street when Marshal White strode up, demanded the pistols, and made the fatal mistake of believing the drunk outlaw had handed them over safely. In the handover scuffle, the barrel swung back toward White and discharged, shredding the lawman's groin. Brocious sobered instantly, kneeling to cradle the dying marshal, and spent 3 months in Tucson awaiting trial. White's own deathbed statement that the shooting was accidental spared Curly Bill from the noose, but his acquittal lit a fuse of resentment in the Earp brothers, who had begun serving as deputy marshals precisely to curb such cowboy mayhem. Tension hardened into open hatred over the next year as stage holdups multiplied, and each side accused the other of provocation. Curly Bill baited Earp sympathizers, shouting across saloon floors that city law meant nothing outside town limits. Morgan and Virgil Earp warned that another innocent shot would earn the cowboys a bullet. When Wyatt Earp arrested Curly Bill for a fresh stage robbery near Benson, a friendly judge dismissed the case for lack of evidence, and Brocious rewarded the deputy with a lazy, mocking salute the length of Allen Street. The showdown at the OK Corral in October 1881 left Curly Bill absent but enraged. His friends Tom and Frank McClory and Billy Clanton lay dead, and Ike Clanton reenacted the shootout nightly to anyone who would buy him a drink. Brocious took to the hills above Tombstone, organizing ambushes that wounded Virgil Earp and killed Morgan Earp. Wyatt, now U.S. Deputy Marshal, formed his own vendetta posse, swearing to wipe the cowboys from the San Pedro Valley. Their inevitable meeting came on March 24, 1882, at Iron Springs, a shallow waterhole in the Whetstone Mountains. Curly Bill and 8 riders lounged beside their campfire drying gear from a rainstorm when Wyatt Earp's posse burst through the mesquite. Accounts from Earp partisans claim Brocious stood and leveled a shotgun at close range. Earp, astride his big bay horse, returned fire with both barrels of a 10-gauge coach gun, nearly tearing Brocious in half, then emptied his revolver to cover the retreat. Cowboys fled, leaving their leader face down in the red sand. Earp's party, low on ammunition and pursued themselves, did not linger to bury the dead. When a patrol returned days later, they found no body, only dried blood, trampled earth, and the burnt ends of a campfire. From that moment, Curly Bill occupied the shimmering border between fact and legend. Some locals insisted Vaqueros had carried his wounded form across the border for treatment in Sonora, where he died weeks later of fever. Others swore he recovered, changed his name, and ranched quietly along the Pecos. A grizzled stage driver claimed to have spotted him in 1890 in Hermosillo, minus an ear but full of laughter, planning a freight venture. Wyatt Earp himself never wavered, stating until his own death that he had shot Curly Bill dead and watched the blood run into the sand. Historians sift the rumors, but no certified grave, death certificate, or notarized sighting has ever closed the book. Whether he died at Iron Springs or slipped off into a new alias, Curly Bill Brocious remains a touchstone for the chaotic, irreverent spirit of the Arizona frontier. Tales of his drunken target practice, his spur-jingle swagger through Tombstone's gambling halls, and his fatal entanglement with the Earps paint a portrait equal parts menace and mirth. He was the outlaw who laughed too loud, drank too deep, and dared the West to tame him, then possibly cheated even death of a tidy ending. In campfire stories along the San Pedro, you can still hear a rider's cackle echo off the granite hills, daring any lawman to prove the legend finally stopped laughing. Elfego Baca first blazed across the public imagination on a raw October morning in 1884, when the smoke of more than 4,000 rifle and pistol shots drifted over the adobe roofs of Upper Frisco Plaza, and locals whispered that one slender 19-year-old deputy had held off an army. The facts were astonishing enough to survive the decades of retelling. Baca, a self-deputized peace officer armed with a Colt revolver and a borrowed Winchester, arrested a drunken Texas cowboy who had been spraying bullets through the saloon windows. Friends of the prisoner galloped back to the slaughter ranch for reinforcements, and by nightfall between 40 and 80 hard-riding cowhands surrounded the single-room jackal where Baca had taken shelter with his captive. They hurled lead through the mud walls until the adobe looked like a sieve, but the floor sat a foot below ground level, and the young lawman crouched in that shallow ditch returning fire with deliberate calm. By the time the siege lifted 33 hours later, the posse counted at least 4 cowboys dead and half a dozen wounded, while Baca emerged unscathed save for bullet-torn clothing and a smile as cool as creek water. He handed over his prisoner, stepped into the empty plaza, and became a living legend in one slow breath. That improbable victory owed as much to Elfego's upbringing as to luck. He had been born on February 10, 1865, in the tiny settlement of Socorro, New Mexico Territory, the son of indomitable parents who traced their roots to generations of Hispanic settlers long before the Stars and Stripes flew over the Rio Grande. His mother drilled into him a fierce pride in heritage and the conviction that even the poorest vaquero deserved protection under the law. His father taught him to shoot by lining tin cans along irrigation ditches and demanding they vanish one after another before the canteen water ran out. The boy's marksmanship soon earned him the nickname El Gato because, like a cat, he seemed to see in every direction at once. When the railroads and cattle trails flooded New Mexico with Anglo ranch hands who thought local courts had no authority over Texans, Elfego saw an opportunity not for glory but for justice. If the official sheriffs were too cautious, he would pin on a badge himself. The Frisco shootout rocketed him overnight from obscure deputy to folk hero, yet heroism invited danger as surely as it inspired ballads. Arrested on murder charges after one of the wounded cowboys died, Baca coolly requested that the bullet-riddled door of the house be hauled into the courtroom. Jurors poked fingers through more than 400 holes and decided any man who survived such odds must have been defending himself. Acquittal did not soften Elfego's zeal. Instead, it stamped on him an aura of invincibility that both charmed and unsettled the towns he rode into. He joked that he had at least 9 lives to spare, and newspaper scribes eagerly repeated the boast until 9 Lives Baca rivaled Billy the Kid in column inches, only with the law on his side. Over the next decade, he wore nearly every tin star New Mexico could offer: Deputy Sheriff of Socorro County, Constable, U.S. Deputy Marshal, even Special Investigator for the Santa Fe Railroad when rustlers cut fences and hijacked beef on the hoof. His preferred tactic was part psychology, part theater. He would mail a polite letter to a wanted man advising him to surrender quietly on Friday. For on Saturday, I shall come calling with a coffin. More often than not, the outlaw was waiting on the jailhouse steps when Baca arrived, unwilling to test whether the legend outstripped the reality. Those who did resist found him a relentless pursuer on the trail and a precise shot once the conversation turned to gunfire. Yet Elfego was never content to remain merely a badge-wearing enforcer. He believed true justice required mastering the statutes themselves. Between posses, he pored over dog-eared law books by lantern light, and in 1894 he passed the territorial bar examination. Almost immediately, the miners' shacks and ranch corrals where he had once tracked fugitives became his campaign circuit as he ran for public office. Voters elected him county clerk, school superintendent, and finally district attorney for Socorro and Sierra counties. Courtroom observers marveled that a man who had defended himself in a hail of bullets could now disarm a hostile witness with a courteous bow and a meticulously phrased objection. Political ambition carried him beyond the territorial borders. When New Mexico achieved statehood in 1912, Baca launched an underfunded but spirited bid for Congress on the Republican ticket, arguing that Hispanic voters deserved a champion who spoke their language both literally and figuratively. He lost, but party leaders learned that Elfego could rally thousands of Nuevo Mexicanos with a single train platform speech. Thereafter, governors of both parties sought his endorsement in close races. His flair for difficult diplomacy extended southward as revolution churned in Mexico. From 1913 to 1916, he served as an unofficial liaison between Washington and the provisional government of Victoriano Huerta, a role that drew suspicion from federal agents and admiration from borderland ranchers who credited Baca with calming skirmishes along the Rio Grande. Adventure never strayed far from him. One spring night in 1914, a Mexican guerrilla general named Jose Inés Salazar escaped from an Albuquerque jail under circumstances so mysterious that rumors pointed to Elfego's invisible hand. Indicted for conspiracy, the celebrated lawman found himself, for once, on the defendant's side of the docket. He defended his own case, cross-examined witnesses with sly humor, and walked free when the jury deadlocked. Reporters who asked whether the rumors were true received a cryptic grin and the observation that freedom is sometimes wiser than bars. Age finally loosened the grip of adventure, not its echo. Baca settled into a modest law practice in Albuquerque, traded his Colt for a fountain pen, and lectured school children about courage, reminding them that the badge meant nothing unless the man behind it respected every citizen in his town. Visitors still arrived at his front porch seeking the chance to shake the hand that had once held off an army. He obliged them all, pouring coffee from a chipped enamel pot and retelling the Frisco siege with the humility of a man who understood that destiny mixes luck with preparation. On quiet afternoons, he would stroll the dusty lanes of Old Town, cane tapping rhythmically, pointing out where adobe walls met the sky and angles a bullet could never penetrate. Elfego Baca died in his bed on August 27, 1945, 80 years old and full of limbs scarred by more near misses than even he could recall. He left behind no fortune, but the funeral cortege wound for blocks as ranch hands, judges, veterans, and schoolboys followed the casket draped in the New Mexico flag. Eulogies praised him as a peace officer, a lawyer, a politician, and a bridge between cultures at a time when bridges were often burned before they were built. Hold your horses. The trail of thrills is just beginning. Tap the video below and ride with us into the next chapter of Wild West legends, where every twist of the dusty road promises another jaw-dropping tale.